behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern ambition, a silent war rages between two women who could shape the future of the British monarchy. One is a seasoned survivor who fought her way from scandal to acceptance, now wielding the influence that comes with being queen consort. The other is a commoner turned future queen, beloved by millions but increasingly isolated within the very institution she was meant to modernize. What happens when personal grudges collide with royal protocol? When whispered conversations in drawing rooms become calculated moves on a chessboard where the stakes are nothing less than the crown itself? This is not the fairy tale the world was told. This is the story of how a simmering rivalry between Camilla and Catherine erupted into a full-scale palace coup, forcing Prince William to choose between family loyalty and protecting his wife. In a world where image is everything and privacy is a luxury few can afford, sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not with swords, but with carefully placed words, strategic leaks, and the devastating power of public opinion. The crown may be ancient, but the fight for influence around it is as modern and ruthless as any corporate boardroom. And in this game, there can only be one winner. The morning mist hung over Windsor Castle like a protective shroud, but inside the ancient walls, tension crackled through the air with an intensity that no amount of royal protocol could mask. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood by the tall windows of her private study, watching groundskeepers tend to gardens that had been maintained for centuries. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had learned to wear composure like armor, but those who knew her well could see the storm brewing behind her carefully controlled expression. The envelope in her hands bore the official seal of the Queen Consort's office. Inside, written in Camilla's distinctive handwriting, was what could only be described as a declaration of war wrapped in the language of royal courtesy. The letter spoke of concerns about the direction of certain charitable initiatives and the need for more experienced guidance in matters of protocol. But Catherine knew better than to take the words at face value. This was about power, pure and simple. For months, she had felt the subtle shifts in palace dynamics, invitations to important meetings that somehow never reached her office, press releases about royal engagements that positioned Camilla prominently, while relegating Catherine to secondary roles. Most telling of all were the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, followed by smiles that never quite reached anyone's eyes. Catherine had hoped her initial impressions were wrong. After all, she and Camilla had maintained a cordial relationship since her marriage to William. There had been joint appearances, shared causes, and what seemed like mutual respect for each other's roles within the family. But lately, something fundamental had changed. The older woman's behavior had become increasingly territorial, as if she saw Catherine not as an ally in modernizing the monarchy, but as a threat to be neutralized. The catalyst had been Catherine's proposal for a major mental health initiative. It was ambitious in scope, targeting young people across the Commonwealth with a combination of traditional outreach and cutting-edge digital platforms. The proposal had gained significant backing from government officials and international organizations. More importantly, it had captured the public's imagination in a way that reminded many of Diana's natural ability to connect with causes that mattered. That comparison had not gone unnoticed. Within days of the proposal's public announcement, stories began appearing in certain tabloids questioning Catherine's experience with mental health issues and suggesting that such a sensitive topic required more seasoned oversight. The articles were never directly attributed to palace sources, but their timing and specific details made their origin clear to anyone familiar with how royal communications worked. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her private secretary. The BBC wanted to comment on rumors that the mental health initiative was being reviewed and potentially restructured by senior royal advisors. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of public scrutiny settling on her shoulders. Every aspect of royal life was performed under a microscope, but this felt different. This felt personal. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent over a decade carefully building her reputation, learning the intricacies of royal protocol, and finding her own voice within an institution that didn't naturally accommodate individual expression. She had navigated the constant comparisons to Diana with grace, carved out meaningful work in early childhood development, and supported William through his own journey of balancing royal duty with personal authenticity. Now, just as she was hitting her stride, someone was trying to pull the rug out from under her. And not just anyone. It was a woman who had once been the most controversial figure in the royal family, who had fought her own battles for acceptance and legitimacy, who should have understood better than anyone what it felt like to be on the receiving end of coordinated palace maneuvering. Catherine walked to her desk, where files related to her various projects were neatly organized. Each folder represented months or years of careful planning, relationship building, and strategic thinking. The mental health initiative alone had taken 2 years to develop, involving consultations with experts, focus groups with young people, and delicate negotiations with government departments and international partners. She opened the folder containing press clippings about recent royal activities. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable when viewed as a whole. Camilla's appearances were consistently framed in terms of wisdom, experience, and institutional continuity. Catherine's were increasingly portrayed as enthusiastic but potentially naive, well-intentioned but requiring guidance. The narrative being constructed was clear. One woman was a steady hand on the royal tiller, while the other was an ambitious newcomer who needed to be kept in check. The manipulation was sophisticated, playing on existing public perceptions and media tendencies. Camilla's team understood that direct attacks would backfire, generating sympathy for Catherine and highlighting uncomfortable parallels with how Diana had been treated. Instead, they were using a strategy of subtle undermining, raising questions about Catherine's judgment while positioning Camilla as a wise mentor figure who was simply looking out for the institution's best interests. Catherine's personal phone rang, breaking her concentration. William's voice was tense when she answered, though he was clearly trying to maintain the casual tone they used when discussing family matters in potentially monitored conversations. "How are the children this morning?" he asked, using their code for checking in when palace politics were involved. "They're fine, but we might need to discuss their summer schedules soon," she replied, letting him know that they needed to talk privately about developing situations. "I'll be home for lunch. Maybe we can review those plans together." After hanging up, Catherine found herself thinking about the early days of their relationship, when the biggest worry had been whether she could handle the pressure of constant media attention. Those challenges seemed almost simple compared to navigating the complex web of family dynamics, institutional politics, and public expectations that now defined her daily reality. She had entered the royal family with realistic expectations about the constraints and compromises involved. She knew she would have to share the spotlight, follow protocols that sometimes seemed arbitrary, and subordinate her personal preferences to institutional needs. What she hadn't anticipated was having to defend her territory against someone who should have been an ally. The timing of Camilla's moves was particularly calculated. With King Charles still relatively new to the throne and focused on establishing his own leadership style, there was a natural period of adjustment in royal hierarchies. William's position as heir apparent was secure, but the specific roles and influence of other family members were still being defined. It was an opportune moment for someone with Camilla's experience and determination to consolidate power and shape the direction of the monarchy for years to come. Catherine understood the stakes involved. This wasn't just about individual projects or personal recognition. The outcome of this conflict would determine how much independence she and William would have to pursue their own vision for royal service. It would set precedents for how decisions were made within the family and influence the public perception of their effectiveness as future monarchs. She also knew that her response needed to be carefully calibrated. Royal families had been torn apart by power struggles that escalated beyond anyone's ability to control them. The key was to defend her interests without creating irreparable damage to family relationships or public confidence in the monarchy as a whole. As she prepared for what was sure to be a difficult conversation with William, Catherine reflected on how much her life had changed since that shy university student had first caught the future king's attention. She had grown into her role gradually, learning to balance public expectations with personal authenticity, family loyalty with individual ambition. Now she was facing perhaps her greatest test yet, not of her ability to fulfill royal duties or handle public pressure, but of her skill at navigating the treacherous waters of family politics when the stakes were nothing less than the future direction of the crown itself. The letter from Camilla still lay on her desk, its formal language masking the real message beneath. Catherine picked it up again, reading between the lines of diplomatic courtesy to the ultimatum that lay beneath. She had two choices: accept a diminished role and watch her carefully planned initiatives be absorbed into Camilla's portfolio, or stand her ground and risk an open conflict that could damage everyone involved. As she looked out the window again at the perfectly manicured gardens, Catherine made her decision. She had not come this far and worked this hard to back down now. If Camilla wanted a fight, she was about to discover that the quiet, well-mannered girl from Berkshire had learned more about palace politics than anyone might have expected. The war for influence in the royal family was about to begin in earnest, and Catherine intended to win. The private dining room at Kensington Palace had witnessed many family discussions over the years, but none quite like the one unfolding over lunch that day. William sat across from Catherine, his usual easy demeanor replaced by the focused intensity he typically reserved for official briefings. They had learned to read each other's moods after years of marriage, and both knew they were facing a situation that required careful strategy and unified action. Catherine had filled him in on the morning's developments, including the letter from Camilla and the mounting evidence of coordinated efforts to undermine her position. William listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the full scope of the situation became clear. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the tactical implications but the personal betrayal involved. "I suspected something was happening," he finally said, his voice carrying a mix of anger and disappointment. "There have been comments, suggestions that maybe we were moving too fast with certain initiatives. I thought it was just normal caution, the kind of institutional resistance we always face when trying to modernize. I didn't realize it was this calculated." William's position in the family hierarchy made him privy to conversations and planning sessions that Catherine couldn't access directly. He had noticed subtle changes in how meetings were structured, how agendas were set, and how decisions were presented to his father. What had seemed like natural growing pains for a new reign were starting to look more like deliberate attempts to consolidate power. The mental health initiative that had triggered the current crisis was particularly important to both of them. It represented everything they hoped to accomplish as working royals, combining traditional royal patronage with innovative approaches to addressing real social problems. The project had taken shape over months of consultation with experts, young people, and international partners. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking work they believed the monarchy needed to embrace to remain relevant. "We can't let this stand," Catherine said, her voice steady but determined. "If we back down now, it sets a precedent for everything we want to do in the future. Every project, every initiative will have to go through the same filtering process. We'll end up being figureheads for other people's agendas instead of pursuing our own vision." William nodded, understanding the larger implications. His grandmother had navigated similar challenges during her early years as queen, finding ways to assert her authority while maintaining family unity. But those have been different times with different personalities involved. The current situation required a more nuanced approach. The tricky part is that she's not wrong about some things, William admitted reluctantly. Camilla does have experience with palace politics that we're still learning. She survived decades of negative press and public hostility to get where she is now. In some ways, her instinct for institutional preservation isn't necessarily bad. Catherine appreciated his fairness, but she also heard the underlying frustration in his voice. William had spent his entire life preparing for eventual kingship, but he had always assumed he would have substantial influence over family decisions long before taking the throne. Discovering that his stepmother was actively working to limit his and Catherine's autonomy was both professionally disappointing and personally hurtful. The question is whether we try to resolve this privately or make it a more formal matter, Catherine continued. If we go to your father directly, it becomes an official complaint about Camilla's behavior. That could work, but it also risks creating permanent divisions in the family. The complexities of their situation went far beyond normal family dynamics. Every decision they made would be scrutinized by the press, analyzed by constitutional experts, and potentially affect public confidence in the monarchy. They had to think like political strategists while maintaining the facade of family unity that royal protocol demanded. William's phone buzzed with a message from his private secretary. The media were starting to pick up on tensions within the family, though the stories were still framed as speculation about different approaches to royal modernization rather than open conflict. But both he and Catherine knew how quickly palace intrigue could spiral into public scandal if not carefully managed. There's another factor we need to consider, William said, showing Catherine the message. The press is already starting to sniff around this story. If we don't get ahead of it somehow, the narrative will be written for us. And we both know how those stories usually go. Catherine had vivid memories of how the press had covered various royal disputes over the years. The tendency was to frame conflicts in terms of personal animosity and power-hungry ambition, reducing complex institutional questions to soap opera storylines. If their current situation became public before they resolved it, the coverage would likely focus on catfights and palace jealousy rather than the substantive issues about royal modernization that were actually at stake. We need allies, Catherine observed, thinking through their options strategically. People who understand what we're trying to accomplish and have influence with both your father and Camilla. But we have to be careful about who we approach and how we frame the situation. William agreed, mentally reviewing the various senior royals, palace officials, and trusted advisors who might be able to help mediate the situation. The challenge was finding people who could be objective about the conflict rather than simply choosing sides based on personal relationships or institutional loyalties. As they discussed potential approaches, Catherine found herself thinking about the broader context of their situation. The monarchy was facing unprecedented challenges in the 21st century, from declining deference among younger generations to increasing scrutiny of royal finances and activities. The institution needed fresh thinking and innovative approaches to maintain its relevance and public support. But change was inherently threatening to people who had invested decades in learning how the current system worked. Camilla had fought hard to establish her position within the royal family, overcoming enormous obstacles and public hostility. From her perspective, Catherine and William's modernization efforts might look like attempts to diminish the traditional sources of royal authority that she had finally learned to wield effectively. Maybe we're approaching this wrong, Catherine said suddenly, a new idea taking shape in her mind. Instead of treating this as a conflict to be won or lost, what if we treat it as a negotiation? Camilla wants influence and recognition for her experience. We want independence to pursue our own initiatives. Maybe there's a way to give her what she needs while preserving what we need. William looked intrigued, but skeptical. What kind of negotiation are you thinking about? Something that acknowledges her seniority and experience while establishing clear boundaries around our areas of responsibility. Maybe a formal division of charitable focuses or a structured process for coordinating major initiatives. The key will be making it look like collaboration rather than compromise. It was a risky strategy, requiring them to treat Camilla as an equal partner in royal planning rather than trying to minimize her influence. But it might also be the only way to resolve the situation without creating lasting damage to family relationships or public confidence in the monarchy. As they continued discussing options, Catherine was struck by how much the situation revealed about the challenges facing modern royalty. They were expected to be both traditional and innovative, deferential and independent, unified as a family but distinct as individuals. Threading that needle required political skills that weren't taught in any formal curriculum. The afternoon brought new developments that added urgency to their deliberations. William's private secretary called with news that several major newspapers were planning stories about tensions in the royal family for their weekend editions. The stories were still speculative, based on anonymous sources and careful observations of recent public appearances. But the media attention meant they had limited time to resolve the situation before it became a full-blown public crisis. "We need to make a decision," Catherine said after William shared the news about media interest. "Either we try to address this privately and quickly, or we prepare for a very public conversation about royal family dynamics." William knew she was right, but he also knew that any decision they made would have consequences that lasted far beyond the immediate crisis. They were setting precedents for how future disputes would be handled, establishing patterns of behavior that would affect their relationships with family members for years to come. "Let's try the direct approach first," he finally decided. "I'll request a private meeting with Camilla, just the three of us. We'll lay out our concerns clearly and see if she's willing to discuss a more collaborative approach. If that doesn't work, we'll have to consider other options." Catherine nodded, recognizing the wisdom in attempting diplomacy before escalating the conflict. But she also knew that Camilla was an experienced player in palace politics who would likely come to any meeting with her own agenda and strategies. They would need to be prepared for a conversation that could determine the balance of power in the royal family for years to come. As they prepared for what promised to be a challenging few days, Catherine reflected on how much her role had evolved since joining the royal family. She had started as someone trying to fit into existing structures and expectations. Now she was actively working to shape those structures and create new expectations. The transformation had been gradual, but the current crisis was forcing her to embrace a level of assertiveness and strategic thinking that her younger self might not have recognized. The stakes were higher than personal ambition or family dynamics. The future effectiveness of the monarchy as an institution depended on finding ways to balance tradition with innovation, experience with fresh perspectives, individual initiatives with collective unity. Catherine and William were fighting not just for their own autonomy, but for a vision of royal service that could remain relevant and impactful in a rapidly changing world. The battle lines were drawn, and the next move would determine whether they were entering a new era of royal collaboration or heading toward a conflict that could reshape the monarchy in ways none of them could fully predict. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived with unseasonable rain battering the windows of Clarence House, as if the weather itself was reflecting the tension that had been building for weeks. Camilla sat in her private sitting room, reviewing notes that her most trusted advisor had prepared for what everyone understood would be a pivotal conversation. Despite her decades of experience navigating royal politics, she felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that preceded any high-stakes confrontation. She had anticipated this moment from the day William announced his engagement to Catherine. Not the specific conflict, but the inevitable collision between different visions of what royal service should look like in the modern era. Camilla had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to reach her current position to simply step aside for the next generation's ideas about modernization and reform. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now in a position similar to one she had criticized years earlier, when senior royals had seemed resistant to change and protective of traditional prerogatives. But experience had taught her that institutions like the monarchy required careful stewardship, and that well-intentioned reforms could have unintended consequences that lasted for generations. Her assistant knocked softly before entering to announce that William and Catherine had arrived. Camilla checked her appearance one final time in the antique mirror that had belonged to the Queen Mother, drawing strength from the reminder of another royal who had successfully navigated complex family dynamics and institutional pressures. The greeting between the three of them was cordial, but noticeably formal, lacking the easy warmth that had characterized their interactions in previous years. They settled into the comfortable chairs arranged around the fireplace, the setting designed to feel more like a family discussion than a formal confrontation. But everyone in the room understood the stakes involved. William opened the conversation with careful diplomacy, acknowledging Camilla's experience and expressing appreciation for her guidance over the years. But his tone grew more serious as he outlined their concerns about recent developments, including the systematic undermining of Catherine's initiatives and the coordinated media campaign questioning her judgment and experience. "We're not here to make accusations," Williams said, his voice steady but firm. "But we are here to address patterns of behavior that are affecting our ability to serve effectively. Catherine has worked incredibly hard to build expertise in her areas of focus, and she deserves the same institutional support that other working royals receive." Camilla listened carefully, her expression neutral, but her mind racing through possible responses. She had expected this conversation to focus on specific incidents rather than broader patterns, and she realized that William and Catherine had done more homework than she had anticipated. They weren't approaching this as emotional grievances, but as strategic challenges that required institutional solutions. "I appreciate your concerns," Camilla replied when William finished. "But I hope you can also appreciate the position I'm in. Your father asked me to help provide continuity and stability during this transition period. When I see initiatives that could potentially create controversy or confusion about royal priorities, I feel obligated to raise questions." Catherine had been quiet during the opening exchange, but she leaned forward slightly as Camilla finished speaking. "I understand the need for coordination and oversight," she said carefully. "But there's a difference between providing guidance and actively undermining projects that have already been approved and announced. The mental health initiative, for example, went through months of consultation and planning before being made public. The mention of the mental health project brought the conflict into sharp focus. It represented everything that was at stake: Catherine's vision for using royal influence to address contemporary social problems, William's support for innovative approaches to traditional royal patronage, and Camilla's concerns about maintaining institutional dignity and avoiding political controversy. That particular project raises some sensitive issues, Camilla acknowledged. Mental health is obviously important, but it's also an area where royal involvement can quickly become problematic if not handled with extreme care. I've seen what happens when members of the family become too closely associated with controversial topics. The reference to past royal controversies was clearly intentional, reminding everyone of scandals and missteps that had damaged the monarchy's reputation over the years. But Catherine was prepared for this line of argument and had her own response ready. "With respect, the landscape has completely changed since those earlier incidents," Catherine replied. "Mental health is no longer a controversial topic. It's a mainstream concern that affects millions of people. Our research shows overwhelming public support for royal engagement on these issues, especially among younger demographics." William watched the exchange carefully, recognizing that they had moved beyond diplomatic pleasantries into substantive disagreement about royal strategy and priorities. His role was to support Catherine while trying to maintain some possibility of future family harmony, a delicate balance that required careful attention to both words and tone. "The real issue here isn't any specific project," William interjected. "It's about how decisions get made and how we coordinate our activities as a family. We need systems that allow for input and oversight without creating situations where some family members feel like their work is being undermined or second-guessed." Camilla appreciated William's attempt to reframe the discussion in procedural rather than personal terms, but she also recognized it as a strategic move designed to put her on the defensive. If the conversation became about establishing new systems and processes, it would implicitly criticize the current arrangements that she had worked to establish and maintain. "I'm certainly open to discussing better coordination mechanisms," Camilla said diplomatically. "But we also need to acknowledge that experience and institutional knowledge have value. I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and I've learned lessons that might save younger family members from making costly mistakes. The tension in the room increased perceptibly as Camilla's comment landed. While diplomatically phrased, her message was clear. She viewed herself as the senior partner in any collaboration, and she expected her judgment to carry special weight in family decisions. Catherine felt her composure begin to slip for the first time in the conversation. The condescending tone was exactly what she had been dealing with for months, and hearing it stated so explicitly was both infuriating and clarifying. This wasn't really about coordination or institutional wisdom. It was about control and hierarchy. "I appreciate your experience," Catherine said, her voice remaining steady despite her inner turmoil. "But I think you'll find that William and I have also learned quite a bit about royal service over the past decade. We've had successes and made mistakes, and we've developed our own insights about what works in the current environment." The conversation continued for another hour, with each party carefully probing for potential compromises while defending their core positions. Camilla made it clear that she wasn't willing to simply step back and allow Catherine and William complete autonomy in their activities. William and Catherine, meanwhile, insisted that they needed genuine independence to be effective in their roles. As the meeting drew to a close, it was evident that no immediate resolution had been reached. They had succeeded in putting all their concerns on the table, and they had maintained the facade of family civility throughout the discussion. But the fundamental disagreement about power and authority within the royal family remained unresolved. "I think we all need some time to consider what we've discussed today," William said as they prepared to leave. "Perhaps we can schedule another conversation in a few days, after everyone has had a chance to think through possible next steps." Camilla agreed to the suggestion, but privately, she was already planning her next moves. The conversation had revealed that William and Catherine were more organized and determined than she had expected. They weren't going to be easily deterred or marginalized, which meant she needed to adjust her strategy accordingly. After William and Catherine left, Camilla remained in her sitting room, reviewing the conversation and considering her options. She had three basic choices: escalate the conflict by taking their dispute to Charles directly, attempt to find some kind of compromise that preserved her influence while giving them more autonomy, or prepare for a prolonged battle of wills that could last for years. Meanwhile, William and Catherine drove back to Kensington Palace in thoughtful silence, each processing what they had learned about Camilla's position and mindset. The conversation had been civil, but ultimately unproductive, confirming their suspicions about her intentions while offering little hope for voluntary cooperation. "She's not going to back down voluntarily," Catherine observed as they approached their residence. "This isn't about specific projects or communication problems. It's about whether she or we get to shape the direction of royal service for the next decade." William nodded grimly, understanding that they had probably passed the point where diplomatic solutions were possible. The meeting had served its purpose in clarifying everyone's positions, but it had also made clear that some kind of showdown was inevitable. That evening, as they discussed the day's events with their most trusted advisors, William and Catherine began planning for a more assertive approach to the conflict. They had tried diplomacy and been rebuffed. Now they would need to demonstrate that they had their own sources of power and influence within the royal household and beyond. The gloves were coming off, and the real battle for control of the monarchy's future was about to begin. What had started as a disagreement about charitable initiatives was evolving into a fundamental contest about authority, precedent, and the direction of royal service in the 21st century. Neither side was prepared to surrender, which meant the conflict would likely escalate until either one party backed down completely or some external force intervened to impose a resolution. The royal family was heading toward a crisis that could reshape relationships and power structures for years to come, with implications that extended far beyond the personal ambitions of the individuals involved. The storm that had been brewing for months was about to break in earnest.